like everyone, I'm pretty cautious in predicting what comes next, because I think COVID won't be the only black swan event we're going to experience. So much of the fate of the region is going to be decided on how China defines its interests and how the coalition building of others can frankly help China to find that settling point where, one would imagine some in the Chinese leadership realise that a kind of quasi-imperial definition of their national security is not going to be sustainable and is going to ultimately lead to conflict.
I really appreciate you joining today and speaking on your really fantastic book. For those of us late to the game on trying to get up to speed, the contest for the Indo-Pacific, and I'll pump that to anyone in North America that hasn't read it yet. It's really a brilliant primer, but not only does it deal with the Indo-Pacific, it deals with sort of the security challenges that Australia faces in the region. And hopefully we can get into that. For those that don't know you, would you mind just explaining who you are, a brief introduction to your background, and then we'll get into your book?
Look, thanks very much, Michael. So I'm Rory Medcalf. I'm the head of the National Security College at the Australian National University. So in my day job, I lead a small organisation that's all about the training, the contestability and the development of the Australian public service, the Australian civil service. And so national security officials across all of our agencies, defence, foreign affairs, intelligence, etc. So that's an education role, but at the same time, I've got a long career in think tanks. A lot of what I do with my college is, I guess, a bit like a trusted think tank for the Australian government, embedded within a university. I also spent 8 years with the Lowy Institute, a very prominent Australian independent think tank. And before that, I had a career in government as a diplomat and intelligence analyst in several parts of this region, the Indo-Pacific. So I guess that's me. And the book is an attempt really to capture a lot of what I've learned and thought about really over the past 20 years, but to present that for an audience in the 2020s, because so many of the challenges I write about are real here and now. Okay,
thank you. Now, to jump into the book, as I said, it covers a broad swath of not only the region, as you explained, it is the Indo-Pacific, and you go through that. Would you mind just giving your brief Coles Notes version on the biggest points that you were trying to drive home?
Sure. And in fact, I'm really grateful you shared a copy of the book with your with our audience here. And I'm going to share another one because, importantly, to understand, it's the same book, but there are two different titles. A little trick of the publishing industry. Not sure I totally agree with that, but the international edition is called Indo-Pacific Empire. And so this is the edition that's more likely to be, at least on bookshops in Canada and the United States and elsewhere. I'm particularly impressed you managed to get hold of the Australian edition. But there is a new edition of Indo-Pacific Empire that's just been released, a second edition in paperback, and that really tries to bring the narrative up to date to at least the second half of 2021. But going to the key arguments, this is not meant to be a book that is about a snapshot at the moment. It's a book about the trends and the trajectory of strategic dynamics, the strategic power play in the Indo-Pacific, especially over the past 20 years, especially around Chinese power. But what I try to do is embed that in a reinterpretation of the history of the region, going right back to, for example, early civilizations in India, in South Asia, obviously Chinese imperial history as well, and European imperial history. And that's why, the two different titles for the book really tell two different sides of that same narrative. Contest for the Indo-Pacific, it's a contest. It is a power struggle, I think, for the world's pivotal region, but there are quasi-imperial overtones to the way China's gone about it. And I think that holds the secret, if you like, for why China is actually going to find it very difficult, and why there are foundations for agency for middle powers and other countries to really resist and push back and try to build resilience in this region. The key points of the argument are that the way we have imagined an Asia-centric region, think about the term Asia-Pacific that was so prevalent in the late 20th century and until very recently, the way we imagine an Asia-centric region has changed. And it's changed because of material realities over, I would argue, the past 30 years or so. Those are that the region is increasingly one system, that it's a strategic and geoeconomic system encompassing both the Pacific and the Indian Oceans, Indo-Pacific. It's a system of connectivity, but it's also a system of competition. And that competition involves particularly the way China is using its rising power, but also a number of other poles of power. Think about Japan, think of India, of course, the United States, and there is a bipolar element to this contest, but I argue that there's also a multipolar dimension. And part of the way that we can and should, as middle powers, seek to manage Chinese power is to use that multipolarity intelligently, to build our own strength and resilience, to ally with the United States when it's the right thing to do for our interests, but also at times to encourage a path between confrontation on the one hand and conflict on the other. But the last point that I'll note at the moment is that, as well as the book taking that long view of an Indo-Pacific reframing of the region, and remember, as the book argues, that Indo-Pacific reframing of the region is no longer a heresy. It's become orthodoxy in the past 5 years. Most substantial countries in the world, other than China and Russia, are thinking seriously and articulating seriously their foreign and security policies in Indo-Pacific terms. The United States, India, Japan, Australia, Indonesia, ASEAN, the European Union, France, Britain, and so forth. So the book takes that long view, but it also looks at the multiple layers of strategic competition in the Indo-Pacific. It's not just military, it's geoeconomic, the use of economics for military power, it's diplomatic, it's sharp power or foreign interference and so forth. And therefore, our strategies in response need to be multi-layered. I will stop there. There's so much else I could say, but that's the book in a couple of hundred words.
It seems like an ongoing debate, looking at some recent commentary in your op-ed with regards to former Prime Minister Paul Keating. The debate is ongoing on how to align this, as you say, you would rather see a multipolarity. Some want to align on either side of the fence. But I think what I'd like to pull back is, you've been thinking about this for, as you said, for decades now. When did Australia get really serious about plotting its own course and also questioning how it can be a player in the Indo-Pacific?
Well, firstly, I'm impressed that you're following the Australian debate. We sometimes wonder that it's a little bit insular. Secondly, you're making me feel old, but that's okay. So, look, Australia has been a pioneer on a couple of things. I think there's, I don't know how well your audience knows Australian foreign policy, but I mean, I think it does actually matter as something of a case study and an example of how middle powers can manage and protect their interests, particularly as China rises. So in the Australian case, firstly, there has been a tradition in this country to argue for a more independent foreign policy. It's a good idea. And it's a tradition that, in fact, our former Prime Minister, Paul Keating, championed when he was in office in the early 1990s. But I think, and I've said this publicly in newspaper articles, I think he lost his way, and he today, out of office, confuses an independent foreign policy for a foreign policy that, above all, respects China. And I think those 2 points are not consistent. You can't simply, abandon deference to America for a deference to China. So on the one hand, there's that thread of independence in Australian foreign policy. On the other hand, this is a country that is simply incapable of protecting all of its interests single-handedly. Look at our geography, look at the size of our continent, small population, contested region, and so forth, and China rising. And so what do we do? And I think the Indo-Pacific idea it has been, for at least, to answer your question, at least the past 15 years or so, animating Australian external policy, explicitly animating that policy since 2013, when the Australian government was the first government in the world to redefine its region in a formal, outward-looking, official, policy statement, our defence white paper, as the Indo-Pacific, even though the term Indo-Pacific has been used on and off for about 200 years. So Australia's had that Indo-Pacific sea change over the last 15 years or so. And we've done it because, firstly, our geography is so obviously Indo-Pacific, and we are a 2 or indeed a 3 ocean country, if you include the Southern Ocean, and we had neglected the Indian Ocean and South Asia and India for much of our modern history. But also because many of the countries with which we had important relationships, not just the United States, but in fact, China, for that matter, a very important economic partner, a trade partner, these countries were rising in an Indo-Pacific context, even if they weren't noticing or articulating it themselves. The sea lines of communication between the Middle East and East Asia and North America, right across the Indian Ocean, through the South China Sea, the Indonesian archipelago, and so forth. These were very clearly the arteries and veins of the Indo-Pacific. And that defence white paper, which is a really quite historic document that I encourage your audience to track down, you can find it online, had a map, a very telling map that reimagined our strategic environment as the Indo-Pacific based on the 2-ocean connectivity of the sea lanes. And then finally, the Indo-Pacific idea became useful to Australia because it did legitimise and explain and anticipate the balancing behaviour that we needed as a middle power to maximise our leverage and interests in this contested region. It explained why an Australia-India relationship made a lot of sense. It explained why we should do more with Japan, we should do more with Indonesia, and we should work to bind as many of these relationships together as we could, hence trilaterals, and hence ultimately the Quad and its re-emergence in 2017. So although no theory of, if you like, the mental maps of geopolitical regions is watertight, and they're all artificial in the end, Eurasia, the Indo-Pacific, the Asia-Pacific, the Middle East, you think about Southeast Asia, they've all been created at some point for some purpose. The Indo-Pacific suits Australia quite exquisitely, and it's been quite pleasing to see an idea that was quietly pioneered in this country become so prevalent internationally, to the point now that we are, in fact, using the Indo-Pacific as the terrain for an argument with fellow democracies like France over what's the best way to engage in this region and manage Chinese power, not an argument over what region are we talking about.
Digging into one of the key dilemmas that you bring out with regards to multipolarity, China, the United States, and creating a course forward for Australia, I'm wondering if you can just explain it a little bit more with regards to the security dilemma and the prisoner's dilemma within the context of the Indo-Pacific.
Thank you. I mean, and look, security dilemma is one of those great frames of reference that I think helps organise our thinking about international relations. It's not the only one, of course, but if you look at the dynamic in the Indo-Pacific in recent years, we have, of course, China rapidly accumulating power, particularly military power, but in other forms as well, and demonstrating a willingness to use it at least coercively, if not at this stage generally violently or forcefully, but that could change. We see other countries responding to that. both in their internal balancing and their external balancing. And taking Australia as an example, Australia acquiring a much more potent and capable defence force, including strike capabilities and including now, of course, quite controversially, a plan to acquire nuclear-powered submarines. I shouldn't say acquiring just yet because it's going to take a long time. But Australia building that hedgehog, or as we say in Australia, echidna strategy, but also with some power projection. Others modernising and ramping up their forces. The United States, focusing on the Indo-Pacific. There's a big argument about whether the US is actually genuinely increasing its military capability in the region, but the perception, at least the perception that China takes advantage of, is that China's not the only one modernising its military and increasing its ability to inflict harm in the Indo-Pacific. Hence, you have a security dilemma, an action-reaction pattern. Now, the way I would engage with that from, let's say, a middle power perspective, from an Australian perspective, is firstly to acknowledge that we are grappling with some of the tragedy of great power politics. I don't go all the way to buy the Thucydides trap argument that's been kind of resurrected by Graham Allison in recent years, partly because I think that that is an argument that is exploited by China. But in the Indo-Pacific, this is, I think, largely about Chinese power and responses to Chinese power. And I guess the Chinese would well argue China's responses to American power as well. So there is certainly a cycle in the region of armament and posturing, not only in military capabilities, but in security capabilities broadly. It is fundamentally about capability and mistrust. And, you can draw on all sorts of examples in the book and elsewhere. I write about the Australian example, for example. We're a middle power, but we are now acquiring substantial and potent military capabilities, strike capabilities, prospectively nuclear-powered submarine capability over many years as well. We're doing this, I'm confident, for defensive purposes, some of them independently defensive, some of them in an alliance context. Other countries will argue, at least the Chinese will argue, that this is really us contributing to an offensive capability, which of course is a bit absurd looking at the size of Australia as a middle power. But nonetheless, there's a general perception in the region that we're moving to something like an arms race. In addressing that, I'd talk about two things. Firstly, I'd talk about the multipolar complexity of the region, and that it's not simply a case of untangling one thread. There are many, many threads to untangle. For example, the India-China relationship. India is feels genuinely threatened, as does Japan, as does Vietnam, as do a number of others, by China's military build-up. That China claims is primarily a response to American power. So pulling one block out of the pile isn't going to solve the problem. But the second point that I'd make is about perception. It's about the way different countries are defining their interests. And that's where, in fact, work I've done a long time ago now on the Northern Ireland conflict, where I really first cut my teeth in studying security in the early 90s as a journalist and then as a student, is that in the end, to achieve some sort of breakthrough in a really vicious security dilemma, that sort of wicked problem, is ideally to have one or more parties begin to redefine their definition of their security, of what matters to them. And in the Northern Ireland case, it was really about peace and coexistence ahead of very narrow definitions of identity. And there's a lot more to that we could argue in a different podcast. But in the case of the Indo-Pacific dilemma, I think it really is about a lot of nations revisiting what are the core principles of their national security. And it does astound me still that a country as powerful as China, and with all of the economic achievements and developmental achievements of China, is willing to put all of that at risk, because at the moment, at least, its leader is defining national security in terms of the imperative to crush the aspirations of 23 million democratic Taiwanese who simply want to be left alone living across the Taiwan Strait. And I think historically we may look back and say, what a weird way to define your national security, that you need to define it in terms of crushing that other. And there are plenty of other examples I can give, but when we hear about the guardrails that Joe Biden speaks of, I think in the summit recently with Xi Jinping, when we think about the need for crisis management measures and the deterrence focus of US Indo-Pacific strategy, which Australia supports and which I support, we've also got to think about how are we informing the perceptions of others. And in the end, so much of the fate of the region is going to be decided on how China defines its interests and how the coalition building of others can frankly help China to find that settling point where one would imagine some in the Chinese leadership realise that a kind of quasi-imperial definition of their national security is not going to be sustainable and is going to ultimately lead to conflict.
Now, looking at Taiwan and the recent developments with China's overt hypersonic tests, and it seems that nuclear is back front and center in foreign policy. For 30 years now, the peace dividend and the global war on terror pulled us away from realpolitik and the challenges of nuclear policymaking. What do you see multipolar redefinition of foreign policy in the Indo-Pacific and this second nuclear age?
So you're right, we do need to get our heads around nuclear deterrence pretty quickly, and the much more sophisticated, ballet of deterrence that we're dealing with in the Indo-Pacific now. And that's not to disparage the challenge of the Cold War. It was enormous, it was existential. I grew up during those times. I have a teenage memory of it, if you like, but I've got a lot of respect for some of the big thinkers on nuclear deterrence who had to think through some very dark thoughts in order to help us all strike that balance and really get through that era peacefully. In the Indo-Pacific today and globally, we're dealing with a much more multi-layered deterrence architecture, to use that awful analogy, and where study urgently needs to be done and where policymakers urgently need to educate themselves and think very dynamically is the way in which nuclear intersects with all of these other elements of deterrence. I've done a lot of work on the undersea dimension of nuclear deterrence in the Indo-Pacific, and in fact the risks that come with, for example, China's rapid modernization of its SSBN fleet, the way in which cyber space, critical infrastructure attacks could, if you like, actually trigger escalation rather than necessarily, knock an adversary out of the conflict in the first round. And importantly, a more sophisticated understanding of the signalling that all sides are going to have to go through if we find that there are conventional clashes at sea, or skirmishes, or indeed a Chinese attack on Taiwan, and how we manage the ladder of signalling to prevent those clashes from escalating. I don't subscribe to the view, however, that that deterring China over the Taiwan issue is, guaranteed to end in failure or disaster or escalation. It's obviously very, very fatalistic, but also I think it underestimates the anxieties inside the Chinese system. Yes, Xi Jinping is projecting, a sense of historical inevitability, that China's time has come, that China's power is overwhelming and so forth. But at the same time, if you look at how careful the PLA has been for decades in its use of force or its non-use of force, you have to wonder, surely there are a lot of reasonably wise heads in the Chinese system who privately at least simply do not know how capable or potent their forces are in a conflict. They are not tested. And in the end, I still think that China's aim is to win without fighting. So there's a lot of space that we can play in. When I say we, I mean the United States, its allies and partners. And countries like Japan and India have actually been better at it than a lot of the rest of us, because they've dealt with this on the front line day by day for years. You know, the Japanese Navy, the Japanese Coast Guard, the Japanese Air Force have been managing the risk of escalation every day for the past 11 or 12 years. The Indians, likewise, on their border, especially in the last few years. And on those occasions where they have stood firm, they've actually achieved gains, at least held the line, and in fact, sometimes encouraged China to look elsewhere in its probing. I'm not saying let's all be reckless, but let's ensure that the Chinese alone are not the masters of risk here. It's an area for enormous study and investment in the thinking capabilities of our strategic establishments. So let's hope that they're doing it.
Since publishing, and it's been a whirlwind of change over the past year, is there a chapter that you wish you would have written? Is there anything that you feel that you missed over the past year that you thought, oh, I was going to deal with that topic, but I just didn't get to it? Is there anything there?
That's a great point. And in fact, that goes to the new edition of the book. So, and I'll make sure that we get to you the paperback, the new paperback that's just come out in October 2021, at least in the Northern Hemisphere. I think it's beginning to reach the Southern Hemisphere too, the new paperback edition of Indo-Pacific Empire. And in that, I have I think quite a substantial sort of 7,000 word new introduction that tries to draw meaning out of the past 2 years. So I guess most of the arguments of the original book, I think, hold true. And that's not for want of testing them. I think as soon as COVID hit the world in March 2021, or as soon as it began to really spread, around about the time that the first edition of my book was coming out, naturally I said, what does this mean for the strategic dynamic of the Indo-Pacific? What does it mean for the world? You know, quite in addition to the horrendous public health toll of the pandemic. Does this change the way that we have been anticipating the 2020s would unfold? You know, a strategic contest with China, a multi-layered contest with the Indo-Pacific, the focus. Well, no. And I think what's depressing, among the many depressing things about the pandemic, is that even unlike the plague during the 100 Years' War in the 14th century, it hasn't prompted a truce. It hasn't prompted China to sit back and say, well, hang on, refocusing on development and the needs of our population, refocusing on stability and coexistence with our neighbours and helping them. Those should be the genuine areas of priority for our external policies. And we've seen a doubling down on so-called wolf warrior diplomacy, on confrontation with neighbours, the extreme defensiveness about the origins of the pandemic. And Australia's a country that's been singled out and punished economically by China for daring to be one of the first to suggest that we need this investigated. So a lot of the dynamics that the book was about, and the dynamic of coalition building, like the Quad, for example, have actually accelerated as a consequence of the pandemic. And the new introduction tries to pull those threads together and say that actually the Indo-Pacific dynamic is accelerating, not diverting. But having said all of that, we still need to keep testing our arguments. And I think one argument that I probably would revisit in a future edition of the book is that question of whether competitive coexistence with China, the stated policy of the Biden administration, and indeed a recommendation in the original book, to what extent competitive coexistence is sustainable with the increasingly hard-edged deterrence we might need. And so what I probably did not anticipate in the book is that with all of the many different Indo-Pacific strategies countries are adopting, some focusing much more on deterrence, some focusing on coexistence, and some, like Australia, trying to straddle both, are there actually irreconcilable tensions here that need to be resolved at some point? the choices for all that, I think, still lie in China. But I think we have to be very careful about making predictions about where all this will end. So I hope the book still frames the challenges of the next 10 years, but I'd like to think that, like everyone, I'm pretty cautious in predicting what comes next, because I think COVID won't be the only black swan event we're going to experience.
The Five Buys have framed much of my service, and it frames a huge, geostrategic pact. I'm wondering if you can explain how you see Canada fitting into how Australia is plotting this course in the Indo-Pacific, and any recommendations you may have on how we can better integrate.
Well, I think there's a lot of scope to do more with Canada, for Australia and Canada, or Five Eyes partners in Canada, or the US or the Quad or others in Canada. There's more we can do. I noted, for example, that earlier this year, 2021, I believe there was Canadian involvement in at least one maritime exercise on this side of the Indo-Pacific. I think the Sea Dragon, essentially submarine hunting exercise, involved Canada, and increasingly we're seeing just enough instances of, whether it's ship visits or joint activities or embedding of forces, to reinforce the view that we can't and shouldn't leave Canada out of the Indo-Pacific balancing that we need, I think, to manage Chinese power. I'd also note that the dreadful treatment of those two Canadian nationals who were essentially used as hostages by China for several years, the two Michaels, who are thankfully freed now, really focused a lot of mind in this country. It can and does happen to others, but it was an example of what China could do to other democracies. So I think we need to find ways to develop a common cause, interest, language, and operationalization of cooperation with Canada in the Indo-Pacific, mindful that, yes, you have other interests, you have an Arctic and Atlantic set of interests that we don't, mindful that, like Australia, Canada is a middle power with finite capabilities. And just in closing, I'd also acknowledge that, in fact, it was a Canadian, Jim Bertelier, very fine Canadian naval scholar, who was 15, 20 years ago one of the first modern scholars to begin redefining the region as the Indo-Pacific. So although Australia took the running, I think, in a policy sense, there were many minds at work in developing the Indo-Pacific idea. One of them was Canadian, and that's just a reminder that Canada, I think, ultimately does not have a narrow geographic set of interests.
In addition to your book, what do you think is the other book out there that most complements your book, and which one do you think most challenges it that you would recommend? Wow,
okay, that's a great question, and really compels me to think. Look, I mean, I do try to read books these days. It can be a little bit unfashionable when we're kind of deluged with immediate analysis in social media or blogs or wherever. But look, I'll give you a couple of books that I would put on my recommended list. I mean, I think certainly in the last year or two, there's been quite a wealth of great material published on really the China dynamic, the strategic contest with China and how to manage it. And, I mean, I think The Long Game, Rashidoshi's book is, it is indispensable. And I think, I would argue more scholarly than my book. I think my book, I'd like to think that my book is scholarly, but I've deliberately written it in something of a journalistic style to really broaden the audience. But I think The Long Game is a really important book. I've actually got a lot of value over the last couple of years out of some of the books on explaining China's thinking, again, in terms that are somewhat journalistic, but can really reach a non-specialist audience. A book that I found very useful a few years ago was Howard French's book, Everything Under the Heavens, really about the way China was reimagining history to use it to its advantage. And I do think that if you really want to take a hard look at the strategic dynamic of the region, then Bridge Colby's new book, A Strategy of Denial, is important. It's harder edged than my book. and we probably disagree on a few issues. I think there's, there is an argument that's made in his book that doubling down on East Asia, particularly Taiwan and the China's eastern periphery, should be the number one priority. And I don't disagree with that, but I think there's something of a false tension between that and the idea of balancing China across the broader Indo-Pacific. I think we have to do both. And the good news, I think, is that in the Indian Ocean, we can still use an economy of force to balance Chinese power, unlike in East Asia. They'd be a few pieces of recommended reading, but I'd also note that if any of your audiences want to understand what's happening in Australia, there's some fantastic work that's come out on the Australian-China debate that makes a lot of sense, and in particular, a short book by Peter Harcher, who's a journalist from one of the Australian newspapers, the Sydney Morning Herald, looking at the China debate in Australia. I'm trying to remember if it's called Red. It's one of those books that has a bit of red in the title. There are too many China books with red in the title. I think it's called Red Zone. It's a really neat encapsulation of the 5 years of turbulence we've had in the Australia-China relationship. Again, probably slightly harder edged than my own analysis. I still think there's scope for Australia to find a long-term understanding with China, but pretty indispensable nonetheless.
And Professor Medcalf, when AUKUS was announced, what was your beverage of choice that evening?
So AUKUS for us was a morning event, right? So it was a 7 a.m. press conference by our Prime Minister, by the US President and the British Prime Minister. And look, to be honest, my first beverage of choice was very strong coffee, because it was a very bracing announcement and it was a well-guarded secret. And on balance, I think it's the right thing. On balance, I think it's a good thing for Australia's interests and security, and it's an important signal. But it's had some pretty unfortunate collateral damage. And I think the damage to the relationship with France and the way in which, I guess, doubts have been raised in Europe about how like-minded we can all be in balancing China, that's concerning. So we're going to need to work through that. So for me, I guess it was strong coffee, and if there was indeed a sparkling beverage that night or one night subsequently, while it may or may not have been Australian, I'd still say that there's a very strong appetite in this country for some of the good things that come out of France, and we would like to find ways quietly to rebuild and repair that relationship and reaffirm the like-mindedness. And just for context for your listeners or your viewers, I think most people are aware of this, but if anyone is in any doubt, the point I'm making here is that the French anger over the cancellation of a massive diesel submarine contract, because Australia had decided the nuclear-powered option with the US and UK partnership to provide that is superior. That's the catalyst for what I'm saying.
Okay. Professor Medcalf, thank you so much for your time, and congratulations on your excellent book.
Thank you very much for this conversation, and